Before some of you start commenting, we will be covering other chapters of slavery, so you don't need to comment, what about X? It will be covered in the future. There are few institutions that can claim to have such disturbing global impact as that of the Atlantic slave trade. From the late 14th century until the 19th century, millions of enslaved Africans were captured, traded for European goods, and sold to plantations in the Americas. As many as 12 million men, women, and children were subjected to the most horrendous treatment. In today's video, we will look at the Atlantic slave trade, the disturbing experiences of those enslaved, and the legacy of this barbaric practice. The Atlantic slave trade, sometimes referred to as the triangular trade, can be broken into 3 voyages. The first was to take European goods to West Africa. There, the goods would be bartered for enslaved people. The second voyage would see enslaved people brought to the European colonies in South America, the Caribbean islands, and North America. There, the enslaved people would be traded for cash crops like tobacco, cotton, and sugar. The trade was so lucrative as at each stop, the traders' holds were filled and profit could be made at each port. To simply put it, slavery is the owning of one human being over another. Often the purpose is for the enslaved person to work for the slaver, with little in the way of personal rights, freedoms, and no compensation beyond keeping the enslaved person alive. Slavery as a practice has been endemic amongst many cultures and societies throughout history, pretty much every single one. There are examples in ancient times, such as the enslaved people of ancient Greece and Rome, to modern examples, such as those enslaved in Nazi concentration camps and Soviet gulags. People were often enslaved following war or conquest, with there being examples of slave soldiers such as the Mamluks of the Arab world or the Janissaries of the Ottoman Empire. But the origin of the Atlantic slave trade can be traced back to Portugal. The Portuguese developed trade routes along the West African coast, and in the late 15th century began to trade in enslaved people. Whilst the Portuguese slavers attempted their own raids to enslave people, these were stopped when they were given access to the African slave market to purchase slaves. Portuguese colonies like Madeira proved an effective location to grow valuable sugarcane. However, they didn't have enough serfs or indentured servants to be able to work the land effectively in the hot conditions, and so enslaved West Africans were shipped to work on these sugar farms in Madeira. And when Spanish colonies in the Americas struggled with labour shortages, they looked to enslaved West Africans. The colonies had attempted to enslave Native Americans, though many escaped or died in massive numbers due to the introduction of the diseases like smallpox. The European serfs and indentured servants struggled to work in the unfamiliar hot conditions, and they proved to be too expensive to feed and to house. West Africans, however, would not be able to escape into an unknown land with distinct skin colour, and they were used to working in hot conditions. In West Africa, enslaved people came from a variety of sources. Some were sold into slavery by poverty-stricken families, whilst others were enslaved to clear a debt. Most were either captured as prisoners of war between rival tribes or kingdoms, or were captured by individual raiders and kidnappers. Slaver caravans would roam their inland to buy enslaved people, dozens at a time. They would then be forced to walk for hours a day, chained to one another at their feet to prevent escape, and as a result, many would not even reach the slaver forts. Many young men in their teens and 20s were favoured, as they would be the most productive workers on the plantations. Along the west coast of Africa, European forts and slaver forts were the locations where human beings were sold. These enslaved people were purchased by European slavers who saw the slave trade as a lucrative investment or opportunity. Slave expeditions would be funded by those with capital to invest. This saw the purchase of ships, the hiring of captains and crew, and the purchase of the goods that were to be bartered. European manufactured goods like textiles, metals, and rum were in high demand by the African kingdoms. But what these African kingdoms wanted most was European firearms. With these new weapons, African kingdoms would be able to wage war more effectively, and therefore capture more people to enslave. In turn, other kingdoms engaged in slavery to obtain European firearms, to either protect themselves or to buy into the trade to enrich themselves like their neighbours. Whilst slavery had long existed in Africa, the demand exploded due to the Atlantic slave trade. Such was the demand that African kingdoms would engage in war for the sole purpose of enslaved prisoners of war and selling them into slavery. As many enslaved people as possible were crammed into the holds of these slave ships. Often the men were kept below deck and the women and children above deck. In the holds of the ship, the men would be chained down, forced to eat, sleep, and defecate in the same spot, and they were kept suffocatingly close together. One notable survivor of these slave ships is Ulada Equiano. Equiano was born in modern-day Nigeria and was enslaved when he was only 10. He would survive enslavement and was able to purchase his freedom, going on to write about his experiences and the campaign for abolition. In his autobiography, he wrote about being loaded onto the slave ship, and it paints a grim picture. I was soon put down under the decks, and there I received such a salutation in my nostrils as I had never experienced in my life, so that with the loathsomeness of the stench and the crying together, I became so sick and low that I was not able to eat, nor had I the least desire to taste anything. I now wished for the last friend, death, to relieve me, but soon to my grief, 2 of the white men offered me eatables, and, on my refusing to eat, one of them held me by the hands and laid me across the windlass, and tied my feet, while the other flogged me severely. The enslaved people on board had no idea as to their destination. Many had heard of the tales of the white men taking hundreds of people away never to be seen again, leading some to think that those taken had been cannibalized. But some of those aboard did not wish to find out what their fate would be. Some attempted to jump overboard when they were permitted time to exercise on deck. Some attempted to starve themselves rather than being subjected to more indignity. But every enslaved person who died represented a loss of profit. Steps were taken to prevent such acts, including the use of the speculum oris. This device would be enforced into an enslaved person's mouth to wrench it open, allowing for the crew to force-feed those who resisted. This process often broke the person's teeth, cut open their mouth and gums, and it even sometimes broke their jaws. The transport ships were often rife with disease, such as malaria and smallpox, and any person found with disease would be thrown overboard. It's estimated that of the 12 million people loaded onto the slave ships, around 2 million died during the crossing from Africa to the Americas. Most of the slave ships were headed for South America to deposit enslaved people to toil in the Spanish and Portuguese colonies. There they worked on plantations, growing the highly desired cash crops, or toiled in the gold and silver mines. Many ended up on the Caribbean islands, toiling on the sugar plantations. Just under 500,000 enslaved Africans were sent to North America, the modern-day United States. Parents and children, husbands and wives would be separated and sent to different locations. Women would often be forced to work as domestic servants, whilst children engaged in work like removing weeds from crops. Life on the plantations was beyond horrendous. Around 40% of enslaved people would only last a few years, toiling in the fields day after day. On the sugar plantations, work would be from dawn until dusk, 6 days a week, under the watchful eyes of overseers armed with whips, which would be used to ensure compliance. During the harvest time, the enslaved labourers would work 18 hours a day, 7 days a week. Many worked in the refineries, operating dangerous mill equipment and boiling machines. Amputations and burns were common injuries for those forced to work in the factories. Other forms of labour would see enslaved people working as blacksmiths or carpenters. It was not always uncommon for the enslaved people to outnumber the colonists, such as Kingston, Jamaica, where around 2/3 of the population were enslaved people. Due to the level of labour, poor nutrition, and abuse, the average life expectancy for an enslaved person in the West Indies was only 23. Those enslaved were routinely beaten by the overseers for the smallest of infractions. Whether this was failing to dig enough holes or collecting enough canes, the threat of violence was used to keep productivity high. Those who left the plantations without permission, even just to visit family members elsewhere, were confined in stocks, shackled and weighed down with iron. Flogging, too, was a common punishment for those who broke plantation rules or dared to challenge the overseer's authority. These punishments were inflicted both on men and women, and there are even accounts of enslaved women miscarrying after being so badly beaten. Over time, it was deemed to be more economically viable for enslaved people to be replaced not by importing them from Africa, but through reproduction. The child of an enslaved woman was deemed to inherit the enslaved status, meaning that they were property of their master, to be sold or to be put to work. As the practice dragged on, there developed a need to justify the horrendous treatment of African enslaved people. Throughout history, slavery was justified through the notion that those with more power could capture slaves. These acts were often permitted or codified by religious teachings. As Christians imposed restrictions on enslaving fellow Christians, and Muslims restricted enslaving fellow Muslims, Africans proved to be a tempting target for slavers. What's more, justification for enslaving Africans was based on what was termed curse of Ham, thought to be the cause for darker skin. This story comes from the Noah Bible story. His son Ham performing some form of transgression became to be seen as an explanation for the existence of darker-skinned people. In this story, Noah curses Ham and his descendants to be servants, becoming a justification for enslaving Africans for both Muslims and Christians. But for the Atlantic slave trade, the justification transformed over time to become even more radicalized. Africans were seen as subhuman, with all manner of scientific justifications employed. Scientific racism and the consequences of enslaved people obtaining their freedom would go on to shape the Americas for centuries to follow. From segregation to Jim Crow laws, the dehumanization of enslaved people would have lasting consequences. But plenty of people did see the horror of the slave trade for what it was. Whilst the rate of the slave trade reached its heights during the 18th century, the push for abolition too was gaining ground. Abolitionists of African, American, and European descent all called for the end of the slave trade. Violent uprisings also began against the unbearable conditions of slavery, notably the Haitian Revolution, which is the only known slave rising that led to the creation of a new state. Some led efforts to resettle Africans back in Africa, as can be seen in the Province of Freedom, the foundation for the colony of Sierra Leone. Accounts written by the likes of Equiano allowed the truth of the horrors of slavery to be understood by those far from the plantations. In Britain, the Quakers, which is a Christian denomination noted for philanthropy, the rejection of war, and chocolate, also led for the push for the abolition of slavery. So too did William Wilberforce, who became the leading figure for abolitionists. In 1807, Great Britain abolished the slave trade, making it illegal throughout the British Empire. So too did others follow suit, with the United States Congress ending the trade in 1808. The British Empire would go on to enforce the ban by seizing slave ships and freeing those aboard. The British Empire also engaged in treaties with African rulers to ensure that the trade was truly destroyed. And in 1833, the British Parliament passed the Emancipation Act, abolishing slavery in the British Empire. Even with these efforts, the trade did sadly continue illegally, as the demand for enslaved labour continued. For example, slavery remained in the United States until 1865, and the trade continued in Brazil until the 1850s. The Atlantic slave trade greatly benefited those taking part in the exploitation of the enslaved people. From the wealth generated by the plantations using enslaved labour, to the African kings growing rich from the trade, to the capital investors funding the expeditions, there was much wealth to be made. For those unfortunate enough to be enslaved, they were forced to endure the most disturbing of treatments, all in the pursuit of wealth.